The rise of nationalism in Europe. In 1848, Frederick Sorrow, a French artist, prepared a series of four prints visualizing his dream of a world made up of a democratic and social republics, as he called them. The first print of the series shows the peoples of Europe and America, men and women of all ages and social classes, marching in a long train and offering homage to the Statue of Liberty as they pass by it. As you would recall, artists of the time of the French Revolution personified liberty as a female figure. Here you can recognize the torch of enlightenment she bears in one hand and the charter of rights of man in the other. On earth, in the foreground of the image, lie the shattered remains of the symbols of absolutist institutions. In Sorio's utopian vision, the peoples of the world are grouped as distinct nations, identified through their flags and national costume, leading the procession. Way past the Statue of Liberty are the United States and Switzerland, which by this time were already nation-states. France, identifiable by the revolutionary tricolor, had just reached the statue. She is followed by the peoples of Germany, bearing the black, red, and gold flag. Interestingly, at the time when Soru created this image, the German peoples did not yet exist as a united nation. The flag they carry is an expression of liberal hopes. In 1848, to unify the numerous German-speaking principalities into a nation-state under a democratic constitution. Following the German peoples are the peoples of Austria, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Lombardy, Poland, England, Ireland, Hungary, and Russia. From the heavens above, Christ, saints, and angels gaze upon the scene. They have been used by the artist to symbolize fraternity among the nations of the world. The chapter will deal with many of the issues visualized by Soryu in Figure 1. During the 19th century, nationalism emerged as a force which brought about sweeping changes in the political and mental world of Europe. The end result of these changes was the emergence of nation-state in the place of multinational dynastic empires of Europe. The concept and practices of a modern state in which a centralized power exercised sovereign control over a clearly defined territory had been developing over a long period of time in Europe. But a nation-state was one in which the majority of its citizens, and not only its rulers, came to develop a sense of common identity and shared history or descent. The commonness did not exist from time immemorial. It was forged through struggles, through the actions of leaders and the common people. This chapter will look at the diverse processes through which nation-states, and nationalism came into being in 19th century Europe. The French Revolution and the idea of the nation. The first clear expression of nationalism came with the French Revolution in 1789. France, as you would remember, was a full-fledged territorial state in 1789 under the rule of an absolutist monarch. The political and constitutional changes that came in the wake of the French Revolution led to the transfer of sovereignty from the monarch to a body of French citizens. The revolution proclaimed that it was the people who would henceforth constitute the nation and shape its destiny. From the very beginning, the French revolutionaries introduced various measures and practices that could create a sense of collective identity among the French people. The ideas of la patrie, the fatherland, and les citoyens, the citizen, emphasized the notion of a united community enjoying equal rights under a constitution. A new French flag, the tricolor, was chosen to replace the former royal standard. The East State General was elected by the body of active citizens and renamed the National Assembly. New hymns were composed, oaths taken, and martyrs commemorated, all in the name of the nation. A centralized administrative system was put in place and it formulated uniform laws for all citizens within its territory. Internal custom duties and dues were abolished and a uniform system of weights and measures was adopted. Regional dialects were discouraged and French, as it was spoken and written in Paris, became the common language of the nation. The revolutionaries further declared that it was the mission and the destiny of the French nation to liberate the peoples of Europe from the despotism, in other words, to help other peoples of Europe to become nation. When the news of the events in France reached the different cities of Europe, students and other members of educated middle classes began setting up Jacobin clubs. Their activities and campaigns prepared the way for the French armies, which moved into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and much of Italy in the 1790s. With the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, the French armies began to carry the idea of nationalism abroad. Within the wide swath of territory that came under his control, Napoleon set about introducing many of the reforms that he had already introduced in France. Through a return to monarchy, Napoleon had no doubt destroyed democracy in France, but in administrative field he had incorporated revolutionary principles in order to make the whole system more rational and efficient. The Civil Code of 1804, usually known as the Napoleonic Code, did away with all privileges based on birth. Did away with all privileges based on birth, established equality before the law, and secured the right to property. This code was exported to the regions under French control. In the Dutch Republic, in Switzerland, in Italy and Germany, Napoleon simplified administrative divisions, abolished the feudal system, and freed peasants from serfdom and manorial dues. In the towns too, guild restrictions were removed, transport and communication systems were improvised. Peasants, artisans, workers, and new businessmen enjoyed a newfound freedom. Businessmen and small-scale producers of goods, in particular, began to realize that uniform laws, standardized weights and measures, and a common national currency would facilitate the movement and exchange of goods and capital from one region to another. However, in the areas conquered, the reactions of the local populations to the French rule were mixed. Initially in many places such as Holland and Switzerland, as well as in certain cities like Brussels, Mainz, Milan and Warsaw, the French armies were welcomed as harbingers of liberty. But the initial enthusiasm soon turned into hostility, as it became clear that the new administrative arrangements did not go hand in hand with political freedom. Increased taxation, censorship, forced conscription into French armies required to conquer the rest of Europe all seemed to outweigh the advantages of administrative changes. The making of nationalism in Europe. If you look at the map of mid-18th century Europe, you will find that there were no nation-states as we know them today. What we know today as Germany, Italy and Switzerland were divided into kingdoms, duchies and cantons, whose rulers had their autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe were under autocratic monarchies within the territories of which lived diverse peoples. They did not see themselves as sharing a collective identity or a common culture. Often they even spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire that ruled over Austria-Hungary, for example, was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples. It included the Alpine regions, the Tyrol, Austria and Sudetenland, as well as Bohemia, where the aristocracy was predominantly German-speaking. It also included the Italian-speaking provinces of Lombardy and Venetia. In Hungary, half of the population spoke Magyar, while the other half spoke a variety of dialects. In Galicia, the aristocracy spoke Polish. Besides these three dominant groups, there also lived within the boundaries of the empire a mass of subject peasant peoples, Bohemians and Slovaks to the north, Slovenes in the Carniola, Croats to the south, and Romans to the east in Transylvania. Such differences did not easily promote a sense of political unity. The only tie binding these diverse groups together was a common allegiance to the emperor. How did nationalism and the idea of nation-states emerge? The aristocracy and the new middle class. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant class on the continent. The members of this class were united by a common way of life that cut across regional divisions. They owned estates in the countryside and also townhouses. They spoke French for purpose of diplomacy and in high society. Their families were often connected by ties of marriages. This powerful aristocracy was, however, numerically a small group. The majority of the population was made up of the peasantry. To the west, the bulk of the land was farmed by tenants and small owners, while in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of landholding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. In Western and parts of Central Europe, the growth and industrial production and trade meant the growth of towns and the emergence of commercial classes, whose existence was based on production for the market. Industrialization began in England in the second half of the 18th century, but in France and parts of the German states it occurred only during the 19th century. In its wake, new social groups came into being, a working class population and middle classes made up of industrialists, businessmen, professionals. In Central and Eastern Europe, these groups were smaller in number till late 19th century. It was among the educated liberal middle classes that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. 2.2. What did liberal nationalism stand for? Ideas of national unity in early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. The term liberalism derives from the Latin root liber, meaning free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before the law. Politically, it emphasized the concept of government by consent. Since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges. A constitution and representative government through parliament. 19th century liberals also stressed the inviolability of private property. Yet, equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage. You will recall that in revolutionary France, which marked the first political experiment in liberal democracy, the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property-owning men. Men without property and all women were excluded from the political rights. Only for a brief period under the Jacobins did all adult males enjoy suffrage. However, the Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage and reduced women to the status of a minor, subject to authority of fathers and husbands. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. In the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. During the 19th century, this was a strong demand for the emerging middle classes. Let us take the example of the German-speaking regions in the first half of the 19th century. Napoleon's administrative measures had created out a countless small principalities of confederation of 39 states. Each of these possessed its own currency and weights and measures. A merchant traveling in 1833 from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would have to pass through 11 custom barriers and pay a customs duty of about 5% at each one of them. Duties were often levied according to the weights or measurements of goods, as each region had its own system of weights and measures. This involved time-consuming calculations. The measure of cloth, for example, was the ela, which in each region stood for a different length. An ela of textile material bought in Frankfurt would get you 54.7 cm of cloth. In Mainz, 55.1 cm, in Nuremberg, 65.6 cm, in Freiburg, 53.5 cm. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by the new commercial classes, who argued for the creation of unified economic territory, allowing the unhindered movement of goods, people, and capital. In 1834, a customs union or Zollverein was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by the most of the German states. The union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated mobility, harnessing economic interests to national unification. A wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at the time.